So we're in for an exciting talk and an afternoon panel. Congressman Thompson will be here in spirit, not in presence. He has sent his A-team, his Chief of Staff, Melanie Reinhardt, who is as knowledgeable about this as anyone. Today is the last day, hopefully today is the last day of Congress for a long break, and they are busy scurrying around. Congressman Thompson represents wine country. That's the beginning, middle, and end of most of the introductions, since that's such an exciting place to represent. He's been in Congress since 1999, serves on the Ways and Means Committee and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. In fact, he's the ranking member of the Terrorism Human Intelligence Analysis and Counterintelligence Subcommittee. He also leads the Congressional Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his Chief of Staff, Melanie Reinhardt, and then ask her to come up. She's been with Congressman Thompson since 2011, started as his legislative director and was promoted to Chief of Staff later in the year. Before joining Congressman Thompson's office, she worked for North Dakota Representative Earl Pomeroy for 7 years, which is a long time on the Hill. She graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, where she earned simultaneous degrees in business administration and political science. She has an MBA from New York University with an emphasis in marketing and finance. Ms. Reinhardt, thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see the faces of so many strong champions on behalf of reducing and preventing gun violence. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I want to thank the National Press Club for hosting us, and I wanted to extend Congressman Thompson's sincerest apologies. He would be here but for votes, so he's very sorry he's not able to participate in this important program and dialogue that you're having throughout the day. Discussions like this are important. There is no separating the Second Amendment from the gun violence prevention policy debate, and that's a good thing. We don't need to separate the two, and we should not separate the two. As many of you know, Mike Thompson is a hunter and a gun owner. He supports the Second Amendment and believes that we should protect the constitutional rights of law-abiding Americans to own guns. But he's also a father and a grandfather, and he believes we have a responsibility to do everything we can to reduce gun violence and save lives. One doesn't preclude the other, and we can do both. We can protect people's Second Amendment rights, and we can put policies in place that cut down on gun violence. When Congressman Thompson was named the chair of the House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, he held a series of open town hall meetings in his district. A lot of folks were afraid that their Second Amendment rights were under attack, and a lot of other folks wanted to cast those rights aside. Both of these views are extreme, and like most extreme views, they alienate the other side and the people in the middle. When you're trying to create good public policy, you're not going to get anywhere when the dialogue is this polarized. But when it comes to gun violence prevention and the Second Amendment, this is where we always get stuck. We're given a false choice that says if you're for the Second Amendment, you can't be for new gun laws. And if you want to save lives, you need to throw the Second Amendment out the window. This line of thinking not only ignores common sense, it ignores the current law. The good thing about the Heller decision was that it provided us with the framework to pass legislation that reduces and prevents gun violence within the confines of the Second Amendment. In Heller, the court said once and for all that Americans have a right to keep and bear arms. That means if you're a Second Amendment supporter like Congressman Mike Thompson, you don't have to worry. Your rights aren't going anywhere. There's no law that's going to take them away. But Heller also says there are limits. That means if you're like Congressman Mike Thompson and you want to put laws in place that keep guns away from dangerous people, people like criminals, domestic abusers, and those with serious mental illness, that's also okay. These kind of limits on constitutional rights are nothing new. The First Amendment protects free speech, but doesn't allow you to yell fire in a movie theater. No one would say this limit undermines the First Amendment. Similarly, the Second Amendment protects our rights to own guns, but it doesn't allow you to carry a gun in a schoolyard. No one would say this, nor does it, as Anthony Scalia said, restrict laws prohibiting felons and the mentally ill from carrying guns. The Second Amendment is here to stay. People have a right to own guns, and reasonable restrictions can be placed on that right. Now, within this framework, we can put reasonable policies in place that reduce gun violence while respecting a person's Second Amendment right. There isn't a reasonable policy that fits in this framework better than background checks. Background checks keeps guns away from criminals, terrorists, domestic abusers, and people with a history of dangerous mental illness. And they do not prohibit law-abiding Americans from owning any gun they want. 16 states already require background checks for all gun sales. One of those states is Congressman Thompson's home state of California. Congressman Thompson has bought a lot of guns in the state. And a background check has never prevented him or any other law-abiding citizen from getting the gun he wanted or from exercising his Second Amendment right. However, there are 34 other states that only require background checks for purchases made through a licensed gun dealer. That means no background check required for a sale at a gun show or over the internet. Congressman Thompson has introduced bipartisan legislation with Peter King from New York that would require criminal background checks for all advertised sales. Sales such as those at gun shows and over the internet in all states. It's the same legislation that was authored by A-rated NRA Senators Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey and supported by a bipartisan majority in the Senate. It's the same legislation that the NRA supported before they were against it. And even though not all of them will say so publicly, it's the same legislation that's supported by a bipartisan majority in the House. In the House, King Thompson's bill has 189 bipartisan co-sponsors. A lot more of their their colleagues have told Congressman Thompson they'd love to vote for the bill, but can't put their name on it because organizations like the Beltway NRA will attack them for supposedly not supporting the Second Amendment. The attacks won't mention background checks. That's because folks making the attacks know that polls show 92% of American voters, including 92% of gun owners, and 86% of Republicans support background checks. No, the attacks go something more like, you're a member of Congress, supports President Barack Obama's radical gun control agenda, and opposes your Second Amendment rights. But that's exactly the kind of extreme, misleading attacks that feed the false choice between the support for the Second Amendment and support for laws that prevent gun violence. They misrepresent the Second Amendment and prevent us from doing anything to prevent gun violence. Here's the truth about King Thompson's background check bill. It's anti-criminal and it's pro-Second Amendment. Some critics will say that expanding background checks is unnecessary because criminals will never submit to a background check. We know that's actually not true. Every day, the background check system stops more than 170 felons, some 50 domestic abusers, and nearly 20 fugitives from buying a gun. But those same criminals can buy those same guns at a gun show or over the internet or through a newspaper ad with no questions asked, because in most states, those sales don't require a background check. This is a huge loophole that costs lives. You don't have to look any further than the sister of Congressman Thompson's State of the Union guest, Elvin Daniel, to see that this is true. His sister Zena had a restraining order against her husband. He couldn't pass a background check. So what did he do? He went online. He bought a .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun, and with that gun, he killed and shot Zena and 2 others. If we expand background checks, criminals won't be able to avoid them by simply driving to a gun show or going online. Critics have also called Congressman Thompson's bill anti-Second Amendment. Let me tell you, if this bill attacked the Second Amendment, there's no way Congressman Thompson would put his name on it. The King-Thompson bill provides reasonable exceptions so people won't have to get a background check if they inherit a family rifle, if they borrow a shotgun for a hunting trip, or purchase a gun from a friend, a hunting buddy, or a neighbor. It bans the creation of a federal registry. It allows active duty military to buy firearms in their home states and the state in which they are stationed. And it authorizes the use of a recent state concealed carry permit in lieu of a background check. This debate over background checks isn't a choice between protecting the Second Amendment or reducing gun violence. It's about the willingness of a responsible majority in Congress to do both. So, why hasn't everyone co-sponsored the King-Thompson bill? Why hasn't it been put up for a vote? Why don't they want to support this anti-criminal pro-Second Amendment bill that strengthens gun rights and saves lives? These are all really good questions, and they're questions that every constituent should ask their representative. We can't keep accepting this false choice of standing up for the Second Amendment or standing up for gun violence prevention. The Second Amendment doesn't preclude gun violence prevention, and gun violence prevention doesn't weaken the Second Amendment. We can stand for both, and we should stand for both. Once we do, our Second Amendment rights will be on even firmer ground, our country will be safer, and fewer lives will be tragically cut short by gun violence. Thank you very much.
Greetings and welcome back for the second panel. My name is Lara Schwartz. I'm a proud ACS staff member, and I'm here to get us ready for our next conversation. Today's panel is about the past, present, and future of the Second Amendment, and as you heard a great deal this morning from a scholarly perspective on the Second Amendment's past, its origins, the way it's being interpreted. We had our wonderful speaker talk about actually how it's playing out on Capitol Hill, regulation and gun violence safety prevention measures, what it's out there for the people who are actually working on this, trying to keep us safe and protect our rights out there in Congress. And now we're pivoting to, I think, the third leg of this stool that we're looking at, the people who are out there looking at framing the future of gun violence safety measures, gun violence prevention measures. They're working as advocates and educators and public speakers and grassroots organizers and researchers. They're working in the shadow of Heller. They're working from where we are today, the individual right to bear arms that's been recognized today, working in the shadow of that. But they're also working in the shadow of the fact that both Professor Waldman and Professor Blocker brought up in our first panel, that the Second Amendment isn't just what was determined in Heller, and it isn't what kinds of laws we might have aren't just, well, everything Scalia said was fine in Heller, we'll just have that. The Second Amendment means out there to the people who, to we the people, it means what the NRA's framed it to mean. It means the opposite of whatever gun regulation is on the table. And so we have a panel of people who are advocating and working and researching and speaking out in the shadow of those facts in this context. To moderate this discussion of our next step, Second Amendment's future and gun violence prevention's future, we have Allison Brown. I'd like to welcome her. From the Open Society Foundations. She has been an advocate for racial justice, including advocating for boys and men of color and educational equity, combating the school-to-prison pipeline. It would be difficult to kind of recite her entire resume here, although you have some of it in your packets, but she is a strong civil rights advocate, thinker, consultant, and formerly litigator, and she is here to frame and shape this discussion with us. So let's welcome her and our panel.
Well, thank you so much, Lara, and thank you to the ACS for this invitation and for the opportunity to moderate this conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it and to hearing from these wonderful experts that we have here today. Just, you know, to connect the dots. So my background really is education and equity in education. And as we deal with traumatized communities, communities that are traumatized by gun violence, traumatized by their experiences, children who are going to school every day with carrying that trauma, it's important that we talk about and learn about what can be done to address gun violence, to make sure that we are taking guns off the streets and out of the hands of the wrong people. And so I am honored to be here today to help have this conversation. I'm honored to be here today with these esteemed panelists. So let me introduce them. Lori Haas is the Virginia State Director for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. The coalition believes that legislative gridlock, in part as a result of the political power of the National Rifle Association, is a central cause of the stalemate to making progress on gun violence prevention. And I won't bore you with all of the wonderful details in their CVs. You have that before you. I just want to give you a couple of highlights. After Lori, we have Brina Malachowski. Am I saying it right? Malachowski. Brina is with, I'm sorry, I have another panelist here, is with Everytown for Gun Safety, which is focused on background checks, keeping guns away from domestic abusers, promoting safe storage of guns, and stronger gun trafficking laws to help law enforcement. And to her left is Jonathan Lowy with the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, and he is the director of the Legal Action Project there. He has helped reform gun industry practices through lawsuits on behalf of victims of gun violence, defended reasonable gun violence prevention laws, and challenged gun lobby-backed laws that place Americans at risk. And finally, we have Robin Thomas with the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, which provides critical support for the enactment of an effective and defensible legislation at the state and local levels by providing information and support to cities and states, making complex legal and policy issues understandable to communities, and supporting pro bono research and support and amicus briefing. Thank you all for being here. I want to pose a question to the panel, and then we'll have a conversation among the panel before we open it up to Q&A from you all. So starting with you, Lori, I wonder if we could talk about, and if you all would address some of the practical solutions that you all have advocated for in your respective positions to address gun violence.
First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be part of this discussion, and would like to share that a little bit of personal background real quickly that informs my perspective and informs my work on preventing gun violence. I myself was assaulted as a teenager with a gun, and know what it's like to have a gun to my head and what that subsequent emotional fallout feels like. PTSD is very prevalent in victims of gun violence. My daughter Emily, many years later at age 19, was shot twice in the back of the head at Virginia Tech and survived that mass shooting, which was really at the forefront in the beginning of such a groundswell of the movement, you know, in gun violence prevention, and what some of the reactions and perspective and policies and paths forward that we've seen in recent years, especially after the Sandy Hook shooting. So, you know, I come at this issue very personally and with a visceral, you know, knowledge of what gun violence can do to persons, people, women, and families. And so I was compelled to begin working on this issue, you know, because of personal experiences. But I continue my work in the work for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence and the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, you know, because it is important work and because we can accomplish, I think, some of our goals. We have some of the framework under which I think we have some paths forward, you know, as some of the members of the panel before us talked about, you know, changing the culture, you know. What are we willing to tolerate as a society? What level of gun violence are we willing to live with? You know, when children are murdered, when more preschoolers than police officers are shot and killed in an average year, and when we allow dangerous individuals easy access to firearms. Our organization works in two ways. We have a C3 that works on a lot of policy and research and, you know, advocating for good evidence-based recommendations. We have a C4 that works on a lot of the messaging and impacting the very culture that I was referring to, with regard to things like, do you want Ted Nugent headlining your family fun day in downtown Dayton, Ohio? Do you want somebody who is that offensive to women, people of color, and others, that he's allowed to speak with just offensive remarks across the board, but we invite him into our community. So we do a lot of work in both areas and feel like there is a distinct coming together of those two areas that are going to move the ball forward. I believe it was the author who said that, when you get to that place where the culture, kind of leads the policy, I guess, the popular culture is taking the front road, and then the policy follows behind. I think we will definitely get there, and I think that is what is going to continue to make this movement successful. And frankly, we've seen success in some areas. One of the things I point to in some of my remarks is the question to some audiences is, how often do we see murders and mass shootings by machine guns? I don't know of any, and I can't think of any, and that's because we have passed firearms acts in 34 and 68 that highly, highly, highly regulate the purchase, sale, and ownership of machine guns. It's working. Regulation is working. We don't see violence, gun violence, by that particular style of weapon, because at a time in our history, our elected people said these are not good for society. They're not good in society. But let's highly regulate them. Let's make sure that they're only owned by persons who are A, B, and C, whatever the criteria are. So we have some paths forward. Regulation works. And I think if we continue the work that everybody on this panel is doing and their organizations and people out in the streets, I think we're going to see success. We're going to move the ball to make the notion that regulations are not mutually exclusive to the Second Amendment. Frankly, I think they'll protect them. When you have dangerous individuals and persons who are legally allowed to own guns have easy access and many paths to owning firearms, then that in and of itself is more dangerous to the Second Amendment and law-abiding citizens than a lot of these regulations are. So I'm happy to be part of the conversation and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
And Brina, as Chief Strategy Officer at Everytown, you are uniquely situated to talk about the practical solutions at the local level. What are some of those solutions that you've advocated for?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for being here, and I'm sorry for not being Megan Lewis, who got stuck in New York, but I happen to be in town, so I'm happy to be here. Excuse me. And I helped start a ACS chapter at my law school, so it's always nice to be at ACS events. Just in case those of you don't know more about our work, Everytown for Gun Safety is the new umbrella organization of Mayors Against Illegal Guns and Moms Demand Action. We are the largest national gun violence prevention advocacy organization. We research, develop, and innovate evidence-based laws and policies and mobilize our 2 million members led by moms and mayors and law enforcement to advocate for common sense laws and policies. And it's interesting to be here and be introduced as operating in the shadow of Heller. It doesn't feel that way from where we sit, actually. I operate very much in the shadow of the gun lobby, which has been a very impressive and powerful force, both here in Washington and in state houses around the country for decades. I read the Heller decision as part of the effectiveness of their work, and as well as their litigation and jurisprudential successes. They have had phenomenal success at the legislative level, in particular in state houses, because they were left alone to do their work without anyone paying attention for many, many years. I'm sorry, I misspoke. There are some incredible advocates in this room who have been in the business of gun violence prevention much longer than I have. They were paying attention, but there was, for a generation, despite the very good work of some people in this room and around the country, there was not a robust national conversation about public safety and common sense gun violence prevention measures. And the gun lobby was kind of left alone to operate in the back halls of state houses and expand the presence of guns in everyday life, loosen public safety regulations, from loosening background checks and permitting requirements to passing and promoting concealed carry to creating to passing preemption laws, which greatly restrict and impede upon local authorities' ability to create common sense public safety standards for their own municipalities. And so Heller was a part of that. And when Mayors Against Illegal Guns was founded in 2006, actually, it was founded by Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, and then Mayor Tom Menino in Boston, who were feeling what many mayors around the country felt, which is that mayors get the call in the middle of the night when a cop is shot or a kid is killed. They go to a lot of hospitals and they go to a lot of funerals. And they really felt like, while they were responsible for public safety and for their police departments, they were getting no help from their state or federal elected officials. Their hands were tied in 42 states because of preemption laws that restricted their ability to create common sense, strong local laws. And from Mayors Bloomberg and Menino's perspective, it was really time to start a new conversation that was about common sense public safety standards. It wasn't about gun control. It was about crime control and about giving law enforcement the tools they need to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. So rather than operating in the shadow of Heller, we actually, in retrospect, anticipated Heller in some ways. And when Mayors Against Illegal Guns was founded in 2006, before the Heller decision, we made the conscious decision to concede that fight and say, you know what? There's an individual right to bear arms, support for the Second Amendment. You can support the Second Amendment while still doing so much more to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people and address the fact that 86 people die from gun violence in this country every day. We should be cracking down on crime. We should be keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, actually giving law enforcement the tools they need to do so. And we don't really need to have the fight that I'm really glad our scholars are continuing to write about and work on. And Michael's book is a phenomenal addition to the literature about how we all got to this point. But from a mayor's perspective and a legislative perspective, there's so much more you can be doing outside of the fight about Heller and the Second Amendment. And so what we focus on is similar to what Lori has discussed and what Melanie spoke about earlier. Our top legislative priority and policy fix has always been strengthening the background check system. It's what law enforcement tells us is the single most important thing you can do to reduce gun crimes and save lives. I think Melanie said this, but in the 16 states that already require background checks for all gun sales, there are 38% fewer women shot to death by intimate partners. There are 39% fewer law enforcement shot and killed with handguns. There's 49% fewer suicides with firearms. There's less gun trafficking. I mean, this is a common sense solution supported by 90% of Americans that does nothing to infringe upon a law-abiding citizen's right to keep and bear arms or ability to buy a gun, but will put up that firewall and better keep guns out of the hands of criminals. So that's our key priority, and as well as other elements of the background check system. As was mentioned in the introduction, we were doing more and more work on the intersection of domestic violence and gun violence. Gun violence in America is actually a domestic violence issue, and domestic violence in America is largely a gun violence problem. Women in the United States are 11 times more likely to be shot to death by intimate partners than women in the rest of the developed world, even though domestic violence is a global phenomenon that transcends most cultures. Domestic gun violence is a uniquely American phenomenon. And while federal law prohibits certain domestic abusers from buying and possessing guns, there are loopholes that make it easy for people to either buy guns. And the federal laws don't go far enough. They should cover dating partners and stalkers, which they currently don't. But Senator Klobuchar has introduced a bill that would expand the prohibitors. There was a wonderful hearing yesterday that many of us were at in the Senate Judiciary Committee, talking about the intersection of domestic violence and gun violence. And to our great enthusiasm, even the opposition witnesses agreed that they had no problems with expanding the domestic abuse prohibitor under federal law to include dating partners. So despite a lot of conventional wisdom in this town in particular, that legislative change on this issue is hard. We are seeing great momentum on this issue. Even though a minority of senators blocked the comprehensive background checks bill last year, we've seen tremendous progress in the states. In 2014 alone, we worked on new bills to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers that passed in 6 states, almost all unanimously or with strong bipartisan support, signed by 2 prominent Republican governors, Scott Walker and Bobby Jindal. And it's, this to us is proof that these are common sense policies that transcend partisan politics, that are overwhelmingly appealing to the vast majority of Americans who understand that Heller is not actually the end of the conversation about public safety. That, of course, if we live in a country with a strong tradition of gun ownership, we also have a responsibility to improve public safety at the same time.
And Jonathan, you sit at a great intersection of litigation and legislation. Will you talk about what your priorities are in terms of practical solutions to gun violence?
Sure. I mean, first of all, the Brady Center and the Brady campaign work on the policy issues that the mayors do, and also that the Law Center does. And we've been around for almost 40 years now, and got the Brady bill passed, and now we're trying to finish the job and require background checks for all gun sales. And I've been with Brady for about 17 years now, and it is great to have new energy and resources brought to this issue. I mean, the work that Bloomberg's groups have done is phenomenal. Gabby Gifford's group as well, and then the Law Center and others. So I think there is more optimism. Largely because of that, because if this was instead of a nonprofit field, if it was a private sector industry, you'd say this seems like a high growth industry. A lot of new groups are coming in, and I think it's because because people know how important this is and that it is a solvable problem. But I'm going to focus mostly on the litigation that I'm personally involved with, me and my team of attorneys, because we feel that some of the greatest success that can be achieved and that has been achieved in recent years has been in the courts. And we are involved in 3 basic types of litigation. One is supporting gun laws that are challenged on Second Amendment grounds, which since the Heller decision has been a very high growth industry. There have been hundreds and hundreds, probably over 1,000 in fact, of challenges to gun laws and Second Amendment grounds brought by either gun groups like the NRA or the Second Amendment Foundation, or by gun criminals. If you're a criminal defense lawyer and you're charged with a gun crime, you should bring a Second Amendment challenge saying the law is unconstitutional, and they do. And we're very much involved in helping defend against those challenges. And I missed the morning session, but I assume the sort of where we are in Second Amendment jurisprudence was dealt with. The short story is we've won almost all those cases, but we've lost a couple, including one just a few days ago in D.C. But the Second Amendment basically has been read to allow the sorts of sensible gun laws that we all support here. The second category of cases that we're involved in is striking down harmful laws, which I've been known to call crazy laws that the gun lobby passes. There was a law passed, an ordinance passed in Nelson, Georgia, for example, a year or two ago, which required heads of households to own a functional firearm and to have it in the home. And it was funny because Joe Blocker is here, and I'd heard him speak a little before this law was enacted about an article he had written, I think it was called The Right Not to Be Armed. And I actually went up to him and I said, that's a brilliant article, it's great, but I just don't see the practical implication. I said sort of half jokingly, I said, I'm going to work to try to find a way to actually use that article in that theory in court. What do you know? Nelson, Georgia complied, and we brought a lawsuit claiming that there was a Second Amendment right not to be armed, and that, in fact, if the Second Amendment protects the right of people to, or enables the right of people to protect themselves in the home, well, the fact is most Americans choose to protect themselves by keeping guns out of their homes. So the Second Amendment, and I'm probably mangling Joe's scholarship a little bit, but that was essentially my trial lawyer's view of it, and so we argued that the ordinance was unconstitutional, and we quickly got a settlement from Nelson where they said they would never, not just said, they wrote and amended their ordinance to make clear that the ordinance would never be enforced, and they recognized this right not to be armed. So that's one example of the crazy laws. There's these nullification laws, maybe some of you have read about, which have been passed in recent months. The gun lobby tends to have sort of a model law that they try out in a friendly legislature, and then they take their show on the road and get it enacted in as many states as possible. And nullification laws basically purport to exempt either all guns in the state or all guns made in the state from federal gun regulation, which is not allowed by the Supremacy Clause, basically. So we filed a lawsuit in Kansas on behalf of our members to, just recently, a few weeks ago, to strike down that law on Supremacy Clause grounds. And we're very optimistic that we'll prevail in that and send a message to other states that it's going to cost them money and embarrassment to the extent that can happen with these people, and that will, so they shouldn't pass laws like this and waste taxpayers' money. And in the meantime, put their residents at risk by exempting these important laws. There's another example which was a victory until a few days ago. Hopefully it will be a victory again in a few months from now, that in Florida there was a law passed which authorized the revocation of doctors' medical licenses if they talk to their patients about guns in the home or about guns in general. And the American Pediatric Association has in their protocol that you are supposed to talk to parents who are your patients about the risks of guns in the home. Now, if they do that, they could lose their medical license. So we brought a lawsuit on behalf of doctors to strike down that law on First Amendment grounds. It was a violation, in our view, of the First Amendment rights both of doctors and their patients. The district judge agreed with and joined the law, but just a few days ago, a 2-to-1 panel of the 11th Circuit reversed that decision. And we're now going to seek en banc review, and we're hopeful that that will be reversed and the law will be stopped. And if not, maybe it will end up in the Supreme Court. So that's the second category of case we're involved in. And the third maybe is the most important, which is we bring litigation to reform the dangerous practices in the gun industry. And that's a big part of the problem of how criminals get guns. There are a small percentage of gun dealers are irresponsible. I could use stronger language, but they basically know that certain sales practices are going to supply criminals, gun traffickers, and other dangerous people with guns, and they make the decision to make a few bucks and do the sale anyway. And criminals get guns as a result, and people die as a result. We bring lawsuits against gun dealers to hold them accountable, basically so that there is a price to be paid for engaging in that sort of irresponsible conduct. So now they feel it is all profit if they sell a gun to a straw purchaser or a trafficker, Well, if they have to internalize the costs of the victims, that changes the financial calculus and will change behavior. And we've seen that sort of industry reform through tort litigation work in many, many other industries. It's a little tougher with the gun industry because the gun industry can run to their state legislature or to Congress, and they have to change the law. Litigating against the gun industry is a little like playing football, and as you near the goal line, they change the rules and tack on another 20 or 30 yards and move the goalpost and maybe put it out in the parking lot. So it's hard to get to, and you have to continue to chase this evolving set of rules which are unique to the gun industry. And I don't have time to go into all of them, but suffice it to say that the Freedom of Information Act, rules of evidence, product safety regulation, the gun industry in some ways are exempt from all of those principles and laws that apply to every other industry or people in America. So there are hurdles, but we are making a lot of progress, and we have, in some cases in settlements, forced gun companies to change the way they do business, to behave more responsibly, and in others changed the law to create precedent which will change behavior. So mostly sales, but also to change the way guns are designed, because there are many safety devices, and maybe we have time to talk about it that would save lives, particularly of children. If this were any other industry, the federal government would require that these safety devices be put into guns, but because guns are exempt from the Consumer Product Safety Act, federal government can't do that. And they can, require safety devices for BB guns, but not for real guns. But again, tort litigation can incentivize, the implementation of safety devices. So that's a summary of our perspective, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. Robin, you sit with a bird's eye view and really can see the impact of this work on communities and providers. Will you talk about the practical solutions that you propose from that vantage point?
Sure. I'm going to actually, because there have been I get to go last of all these amazing speakers today, I'm going to try to just give a quick sense of how I see this all fitting together, rather than kind of repeat what so many of my esteemed and brilliant colleagues have said before. We were started, my organization, 21 years ago after a big mass shooting at a law firm in downtown San Francisco. And the legal community of San Francisco got together and said, well, perhaps lawyers can play a role in helping with this problem and make something good come out of this tragedy. And so the organization was formed, and the hope was to do a few things. One was to start tracking information. I brought our most recent publication. It's super light reading. You might all enjoy. And it's a compilation of gun laws in America. One of the cool things about it is it really gives you a sense of how complex this area of law is. Brina talked a bit about background checks. Background checks themselves have a really complex set of issues that goes along with how records are reported, what categories of people are prohibited, how that information is utilized. I mean, you say background checks, but those of us on the stage know that just that is in and of itself a really complex regulatory area. You add on top of that so many other ways in which guns can be regulated, each one which has a different impact and addresses a different part of the problem. There's accidental deaths, there's homicides, there's suicides. Each one of these components of what comprises this epidemic has different policy approaches and solutions that can be applied to address them. We at the Law Center believe strongly that it is local and state governments that often know best what is appropriate to address the particular problems of their community, and we try to provide information and support to whatever those issues are. I think a little bit different from what some of the other groups do. We try to provide sort of a fulsome approach, and we track what's happened. Before I touch very briefly on the litigation piece, I just want to mention something that others on the stage have said, which is that because we've been doing this a while, and because what we do often is track what's happening out there, what I've seen in the last 2 years is an incredible sea change on this issue. You have to be an eternal optimist just to do this work in the first place. But I will say that in the last 2 years, there's been real cause and support for that optimism, because since the shooting at Newtown, we usually get requests from maybe 4 or 5 states to help, draft or support gun regulations, or we see movement in maybe 4 or 5 states in the right direction. After Newtown happened, we got calls from 30 states, and 21 of those states passed significant gun regulations. Some of them were sweeping packages in states like Connecticut and New York. I mean, the kind of change in regulation we never would have dreamed possible. And now with groups like Everytown that are really building a formidable grassroots movement alongside the moms and with what Gabby Giffords is doing, not only are they making that concerted effort to find opportunities at the state level to push regulations that are supported by the population and that have an impact, but they have the pieces in place that you need to make that happen. They have lobbying dollars, they have grassroots support, they have policy experts. So these changes are for the first time coming in a sweeping way, again, building on a model the other side has used so well. And finally, I'm seeing, from my vantage point, all the way in San Francisco, which is super far away, but we get to sort of watch and see the way in which things are moving and happening, and it's been so incredibly exciting and so incredibly inspiring, watching the growth of this movement, seeing the energy and the new energy and passion coming in to make those changes at the state level. We strongly believe states are where change is possible. State legislators are more responsive. The politics tend to be a little more malleable in ways that Washington, D.C. isn't always. And it's been just incredibly exciting. So that's just sort of my quick take on the last couple of years at the legislative level. And we are really excited to see how that's continuing to expand and grow. It's sort of a little bit of a domino effect that is really inspiring. I just want to tie that for a second onto the litigation side, because we believe in the work that we do that the litigation and the legislation has to really be looked at in conjunction. It's in part because of what the first panel this morning was talking about, which is that the Second Amendment, if not an actual obstacle, is certainly a rhetorical impediment. And without addressing the challenges that the Second Amendment poses in doing our work, we're sort of giving away too much to the other side. Part of what's super exciting about Second Amendment work is that we're just crushing them out there. We track about 900 to 1,000 cases that have been filed since the Heller decision, and as Michael Waldman mentioned this morning, we have found that our side, promoting gun safety and gun responsibility and gun reform, we've won in about 96% of those cases. So there are a few outliers where laws have been struck down, but almost uniformly these laws are being upheld, and that includes everything from assault weapon restrictions, registration and licensing schemes, very, very restrictive concealed carrying, permitting schemes, literally across the board. These laws are being upheld even in conservative circuits where we might not expect it. And to take it a step further, the Supreme Court, as was mentioned this morning, has had over 60 opportunities to take up these decisions upholding these laws and has chosen not to do so, thereby continuing to uphold these really, really strong laws. Even in the few fringe cases that they have taken on this issue, which made many of us very nervous in light of Heller and McDonald, they have upheld restrictions around sort of fringe issues of domestic violence and some other aspects. So the courts have been phenomenal. I was talking to the San Francisco city attorney recently defending very, very stringent regulations in the city of San Francisco, and I said, wow, it must be really hard continuing to fight all of these battles in the courts to uphold these strong laws here. And he literally laughed and said, oh no, it's awesome, because we go into court and these guys are just getting crushed. Their arguments, the judges look at them like they're insane. I mean, you might be able to bully and buy politicians in some cases, but it really doesn't work with judges very well. So on the litigation side, on the Second Amendment side, which is not to say that the Supreme Court won't take this up again at some point, and I don't think anyone in this room would pretend to know exactly how that would turn out at this point, because it's a pretty tight call with a 5-4 decision in the first 2 cases, and we don't really know where it's going. But up until they do, for now, we can certainly say the Second Amendment presents basically no obstacle whatsoever to the kinds of legislation that those of us on the stage are working towards. So from my perspective, legislatively, we have like so many things we can do that we know prevent gun violence. There's really great research coming out. Research is a whole nother subject we didn't really touch on much today, but is a really interesting piece of this conversation, because when courts look at these laws, when they are challenged, and we strongly encourage local jurisdictions to make sure they include studies and findings and information along with these laws, because when they are challenged, it really helps to have strong, as Brina mentioned, research-driven solutions. That makes it a lot easier to defend these laws in court. It's really helpful in persuading legislators and the public at the efficacy. It's not that I believe that should be how we address legislation necessarily in this country, but it's an intelligent way to approach this issue in light of how contentious it tends to be. So we have a website that has more information than any person could possibly want to know about gun stuff, where you can find out more about the specific types of policies that are feasible out there and that are in place in various states. I'll just close by saying that another part of this work that has been really inspiring to me in the last few years is the fact that we are all working together. There are more of us in this growth industry. We are doing our best to collaborate both in Washington, D.C. to try and get traction, but also in states across the country. And the results have been profound. And so, again, as the eternal optimist, I'm always looking at it through the lens of how are we winning and succeeding and how can we continue to do better. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. And I'm always writing op-eds in newspapers because I go on TV or I meet with people and they say, oh, but we couldn't get that background check bill passed in Washington after Newtown, and it must be so frustrating. And I'm like, no, really, it's been great. We're totally winning. Look at all these states and look at what's happening. So my message is always you have to scratch the surface to see what is really going on and how well movement is going in the right direction. But we all need to be, I think, talking about that in a way that people can understand and can get a better hope from.
Thank you. So I am full of questions, but I will try to control myself so that we can turn it to you all. Lori, I wonder, on that note of messaging, will you talk about the importance of messaging, who controls the conversation in the country right now? I know that you've done a lot of work to kind of counteract the NRA messaging around gun control. How important is messaging, strategic communications, and how does it happen effectively around the message that you want to deliver?
From a movement perspective, we recognized that some of the framing and some of the messaging, by our advocates and by our supporters and by elected leaders, frankly, was falling short. And we looked at this more than several years ago and came together, a number of groups across the country, a number of organizations, a number of backgrounds, and really put together a research effort and that culminated in a messaging guide that was printed and shared and distributed about 3 weeks before Newtown happened. So very, very fortuitously for the movement and for our elected leaders, frankly, to be able to respond in a good way, we were able to recognize the language and the framing that works. The gun lobby has owned this freedom, frame for so long, and we purport and suggest that you, me, others, deserve to be free from gun violence. As a society, that is a goal and that is a right of all of us to own and to expect. So the messages out there that resonate with everyday people on the streets and constituents and families and neighbors, is the notion that we all deserve to be free from gun violence, that we need more regulation to expect that, to have that, and to enjoy that freedom, that we all deserve to be free from gun violence, that, we can move the policy forward, we can move the culture forward, and hopefully we can move our elected people, forward to pass the correct legislation by using some of that messaging, some of that language that has been tried and true, not to be so, formulaic, but it does work, and it's been shown to work, and the messaging guide was very, very helpful, I know, to frankly, the current administration and Congressman Thompson and others on the gun task force. So messaging is important. Behind that messaging needs to be good policy, good litigation, good legislation, all of the above to answer the solutions. But messaging is very important to the movement as a whole, and to recognizing, that the gun lobby has used that messaging and that frame for many, many years to promote, frankly, greed. They want gun sales, to continue to rocket. It's like one of the messages out there right now is just, how many times can they use President Obama's "coming for your guns" to promote the next sale, the next sale, the next sale, the next sale, so they use messaging effectively. I think the gun violence prevention movement also is using messaging effectively now, and I think we're going to win on that. It is helpful, to pierce their messaging, pierce their myth, and put them in the space that they really belong, which is a lobby. They are a lobby. They're promoting gun sales, and I like to suggest that they have no more place at the table in discussing public safety than the tobacco lobby has in, looking for solutions to lung cancer. So that would be my message.
Brina, when I hear some of the proposals that come from the progressive side of things around gun safety, the racial justice advocate in me cringes a little, honestly. And when I think of Columbine, for example, and what happened after the Columbine shootings with zero tolerance policies, draconian policies being implemented in schools, and that disproportionately impacting on Black and brown children, I wonder, as we think about, cracking down on straw purchasers and other things that we might put in place, if there's a conversation that's happening around how to do that equitably and around who will be policed with some of these policy proposals.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you raised that. I mean, the reality of gun violence in this country has an unavoidable racial component, and the victims of gun violence in this country are disproportionately people of color. Excuse me, and while the media disproportionately focuses on shootings in places like Columbine that are whiter than average, we think it's imperative to be talking about everyday gun violence and highlighting the stories of everyday gun violence and looking for solutions that are going to crack down on handgun violence and daily violence, not just the more anomalous situations that often capture our national attention. I think I do not have a background in education, so I would defer to you on the school policy components. I would actually love to continue that conversation elsewhere. Our orientation, in part because of our policy expertise, has been really to focus on the supply of illegal guns. In a city and this is in part because of our origins as an organization of mayors. In New York City, for example, 90% of crime guns are originally purchased out of state, and not just out of state, but we know which states they come from, right? Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina and other states nearby that have much looser, weaker gun laws than New York does. So while I think the problems of urban violence in particular, if you're looking at a place like New York City, are complex, and there is a range of interventions and community development opportunities that I think we as a society need to pursue, where first Mayors Against Legal Guns and then every town kind of went as a matter of firearms policy was to really look at the illegal markets in this country and the national network, and seeing that as a point of intervention. While there's a kind of range of crime reduction and violence prevention and community development programs that are going to ultimately strengthen our communities and promote public safety, we were really focused on looking at the illegal supply of guns and how to stop that flood of guns into our communities. So, I would say in response, I don't see some of the school policies you referred to as affecting the flood of guns into our streets, which is where our primary focus continues to be. One of the better things, if you can put it that way, to me, that came out of the Columbine shooting that actually I think is worth mentioning as it relates to some of the other comments that have been made, because I think it speaks to the myth of the gun lobby and where our politics are a little bit. Some of the Columbine guns came from a illegal sale at a gun show that happened because there was no background check required to an underage buyer. So the Colorado State Legislature, following the Columbine shooting, considered a bill that would require background checks for all gun sales at gun shows. The legislators punted and didn't ultimately pass the bill. But a group of Republican lawyers actually in Denver launched a campaign and got it on the ballot, so that in the fall of 2000, the voters of Colorado passed a background check initiative that would require background checks for all gun show sales in Colorado by more than 70%. And that is an important statistic because, as I'm sure you're all very aware, Al Gore did not make it through the Electoral College in 2000, and one of the reasons why he didn't was he did not win Colorado, which is one of the top states. Al Gore and Bill Bradley had a rather prominent conversation about gun violence prevention and firearms policies during the primary, and that was one of the things that Democrats in this town pointed to as a reason for Gore's failure to capture the White House, put it that way. It wasn't exactly a loss, right? But he did not win Colorado, right? And that's one of the things. If he'd only won Colorado, a state with a strong tradition of gun ownership, there's no way that he could talk to rural Western gun owners, and therefore, George Bush became president. In fact, the voters who voted against Al Gore overwhelmingly voted for a common sense measure to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. That is not a partisan issue. It is different from it is something that ordinary voters in a wide range of places can keep in mind. And I think that to us, those are the evidence-based policies that are going to reduce school shootings as well as keep guns off our streets in all of our communities. And we're rather bullish about the notion that this is a politically difficult thing to do because we've had success in places with strong traditions of law-abiding gun ownership and with strong streaks of Republican power.
Jonathan, in your 17 years at the Brady Center, have there been strategies that you've proposed or worked to support that have not worked so well that maybe we should avoid as we think about this work?
Yes, but I'm not sure if I'm going to tell you what they are. I will say that I think all of us in this issue have gotten smarter about focusing on policies that will save the most lives. And, there are some issues which, I can say this because Representative Thompson's not in the room, politicians love but are not necessarily the most effective as far as saving lives, you can imagine they fit into sound bites better. And they're helpful, but not as helpful. And I think background checks and expanding background checks for all gun sales, I think we all agree, is the most effective thing that we can do to save lives. And all of at least all of the sort of major gun violence prevention groups and all that I can think of actually are in agreement on that and are on the same page. And after Newtown, that was our major focus. So I think that's something we've learned, and Newtown's a great example because background checks would not have prevented Newtown. So it was and that may have been actually one of the reasons possibly that Newtown was not the sort of perfect impetus for Manchin-Toomey, because there was a policy disconnect. But I think it was a good thing that we didn't just lurch to what was the policy fix for this incident that everyone's all excited about, and let's try to get that passed. And you could have had, high-capacity magazines was one, and we support that, but I think we all recognize that was a less effective proposal as far as saving lives than background checks. So I think that's a sort of basic lesson that we've learned. And the litigation ones I will not admit to with the microphone on, but for policy, I think that's an important one.
And Robin, you mentioned this in your remarks, research. And what are the research needs for the movement? And what have been successful research methods and strategies that have come out of it?
So without spending too much time, I'll just briefly say that it's one more way in which I think the NRA and the gun lobby has been very, very effective. That in 1996, they managed to get something passed in Congress which basically cut funding through NIH and CDC, which had been happening before that. And actually the very first study that had been done through some work being done by CDC showed definitively that guns in the home increase the risk of someone in the home being harmed by the gun. I believe the number is 22 times more likely, although I think that's less important than just the fact that it was definitive. And I think that the gun lobby quickly realized a lot of research coming out of CDC and NIH was going to be a big problem for their overarching message, which was guns make you safer. And so they made sure that all of that research was kiboshed. So there is basically, in light of how many people die every year and are injured every year from guns, when you compare it with diseases, when you compare it with car deaths, it's unbelievable to me that our government is doing basically no research whatsoever on the problem, on what causes it, on what ways it can be prevented, on what steps can be taken. But it's not by chance. That was a concerted effort made by the gun lobby. As a result, there hasn't been a ton of research done on this issue, and that has empowered the other side or emboldened them to say, well, this doesn't work, or we don't know how to fix this problem, or it's just not fixable, which is blatantly not true, because to the extent there's been some privately funded research coming out of Harvard, coming out of Hopkins, UC Davis. I mean, there is research being done, even coming out of groups here at the table, which isn't always peer-reviewed, but certainly is based on research-driven information that we have available. We know for sure when the research is done on one gun a month laws, background checks, that it has an impact on reducing gun violence. And that is really useful information in communicating with the public, in communicating with legislators. And we need more of it pretty much across the board. We need peer-reviewed research. It would be awesome if it was coming out of the government from CDC and NIH. If not, it needs to be coming out of the kind of venerable institutions that are respected in the same way. Obama did say after Newtown that he wanted to allocate, I believe, $10 million for new research through CDC. That money, I don't believe, has been approved by Congress. If anyone at the panel knows differently, you can tell me, but my understanding is that that money hasn't yet started flowing, but there are proposals being put out through CDC for new research. And again, the kinds of research that would look definitively at the types of regulations those of us working on this issue believe would be impactful and we know are most likely to be impactful, and showing sort of the true results of that so that we can go forward not just believing and understanding what works, but also with the kinds of hard data that is truly persuasive across the board. And I can tell you right now, I'll put myself out on the line here and say, if and when all of that research is done, it will prove our case. I have absolutely no doubt about that. The little research that is done, not in every single type of policy, but almost across the board, has a definitive impact on reducing gun violence in one way or another. Why else would the other side have made sure the research isn't being done? If they truly believed they were right, why wouldn't they allow the research to be done to prove that? Because they know that the research is going to show that smart gun regulations do prevent violence and do decrease injuries. So that's sort of my brief answer, but there's certainly a lot more, I think, that could be said.
Chime in on that too. You know, we use research in our advocacy in two different ways. One is to illustrate the scope of the problem, which just too many people in this country don't, and in particular legislators and their staff, don't truly understand or appreciate. And the second is, as Robin said, is really to prove our case and show that smart gun laws work, which we know, but we could use more evidence showing. To the first point, one area of inquiry that we've really looked at is the growing space of internet sales and illegal internet sales. You know, so much in part because of the freeze at the CDC that led to a chilling effect for many years. A lot of data and a lot of the conversation about this issue originated and kind of stagnated in the 90s, which was a different world in one obvious way, which is that it was before the internet had created what is now a vast virtual gun show. And there are now websites like armslist.com and glocktalk.com and dozens of others that create anonymous online forums for people to buy and sell guns. Places like Craigslist and eBay don't actually allow users to buy and sell guns, so these other websites have emerged where strangers can easily buy and sell guns. And we've done a series of undercover investigations trying to explore and unearth what's going on there. Perhaps unsurprisingly, criminals are disproportionately gravitating there and finding strangers who can buy and sell guns without any background checks or questions asked. So, for example, and I encourage you all to go to our website, everytown.org, and check out. We have many reports and multimedia information about this stuff. But places like armslist.com, there are tens of thousands of guns for sale at a given time. You can actually click on a drop-down menu and search for a private seller. So if you're looking to avoid a background check, you can find all of the private sellers right near you who are advertising guns for sale. We found that 1 in 30 of the want-to-buy ads posted on armslist.com at a given time were posted by people who we could figure out were criminals who are prohibited from buying guns. And those are the ones that we could figure out. Obviously, these are anonymous post-classified ads that don't have much trace. That is a much higher percentage than the number of denials at a licensed dealer, meaning our theory that the presence of an easily accessible online market of strangers is pulling criminals from licensed dealers and from the light of day into this online black market. And I think Melanie said this earlier, but the terrible story of Elvin Daniels' sister, who was murdered by her abusive ex-husband, along with 3 other people, and 4 shot at her workplace in Wisconsin, at a spa in Wisconsin about a year and a half ago. The shooter, had a protective order against him, which was immediately entered into the background check system. He would have failed a background check if he went to a gun dealer. We think he knew that, and he posted a want-to-buy ad on armslist.com, and 24 hours later was exchanging cash for a gun in a McDonald's parking lot. So that's what's going, that's the private sale loophole in the age of the internet. And because of the work that we and a few other people are doing, we're starting to get a sense of the scale of it. But this is the kind of thing that there should be much more research going on, as well as enforcement. I mean, ATF should be doing the kinds of undercover stings and operations that we're doing as researchers, but with their law enforcement power to really crack down on this new, terribly frightening marketplace.
So I mentioned that I'm full of questions, but it is your turn. And I want to, before we open the floor, we are privileged with the presence of Dr. Roger Mitchell, who is the Chief Medical Examiner for the District of Columbia. And Dr. Mitchell, I wonder if you would frame a question to the panel based on your experience. And I will say that Dr. Mitchell has been very active in talking to communities about gun violence, seeing it firsthand in the work that you do, and really trying to convey the message that that gun control and gun safety is critical to saving lives. So just based on your experiences, I wonder if you would pose an initial question.
Thank you for that. Great discussion. One of the things that I wanted to just kind of bring to the attention is the research, right? So the main research arm of the Centers for Disease Control that would be involved in this is the Injury Prevention and Control, the Violence Prevention section in particular for the CDC. And they have a program called the National Violent Death Reporting System, or NVDRS, right? So NVDRS, there's a lobby group, and I'm hoping that you guys are partners with the National Research Violence Prevention Network, National Violence Prevention Network. If you're not, the National Violence Prevention Network, their primary lobby is to get funding for NVDRS, right, which is the research arm for violent deaths in this country from a health perspective. And it's great to hear you talk about the CDC when we talk about violence prevention, because violence prevention by itself, the legal and legislative construct, will not by itself give the body that this work needs. It's going to be through healthcare. It's going to be through emergency room surveillance. It's going to be through your medical examiner data. So NVDRS just got $5 million. It passed. So that is the program that was just extended funding, $5 million. It is currently in 18 states. They've extended funding to allow for 28 states to come in. we really need all 50 states to be involved in this type of violence prevention surveillance. And this surveillance is currently law enforcement and medical examiner or coroner data. So really my question is, and I think that from how you're responding to the statement, is the question is how are you truly engaging the other sides of this conversation from the healthcare sector and from the public health? And if not, or if you are, what added value would it bring to engage the public health sector in this conversation in a way that can allow for true understanding of the morbidity and mortality surrounding this issue of violence prevention?
Thank you. Lori?
I can speak to one component of it. A couple of thoughts come to mind in regard to your question. Virginia is one of those 18 states that has the violent death reporting system. We were actually one of the first. And contrary to our reputation, because we have some lacking gun laws and permissive gun laws, and the NRA headquarters are in Virginia, we have state agencies that are very, very good and very, very thorough. Our state police are awesome. The Virginia Violent Death Reporting System participates, and they do a good job. At the nonprofit that I work for, we do in fact recognize and engage in and participate with the public health community and the public health policy people, recognizing, as so many at the table and in the audience have suggested, is, we need some research. We need some data to provide some of the structure, and the building blocks that we need to promote and advocate for these particular policies. You can have a policy, you can have a suggestion, but if you don't have that underpinnings of it to make it successful, we don't think it'll go there. We convened a consortium, is what we've called it, and it includes mental health treatment providers, it includes public health and academics, it includes lawyers and advocates and others across a wide range of areas, for expertise from medical doctors to lawyers and others, and came up with some reports recently that are evidence-based. They're driven by the evidence, and the public health conversation would contribute. I think Robin stated it so well. She said she'd stake her reputation on it. If the research was there, if the data was there, if the evidence was there, it would all support, I think, some of the efforts. One of the successes that we have seen coming out of these evidence-based reports, they're called Guns, Public Health, and Mental Illness, an evidence-based approach for state or federal policy, is the fact that you can then take this information and data and go to your legislator and say, okay, a person who has, an alcohol or drug abuse and that is definable and recognizable based on 2 or 3 convictions is at a greater propensity to commit gun violence than the average person on the street. And you then have that research and that data behind you. But I think the public health world could contribute in just a vast array of areas to the success of this conversation. We suspect it's there, but I think the public health community could contribute greatly, and we appreciate any work you want to do on this. We'll take all the help we can get.
Can I just briefly add, I know we come from a variety of perspectives in this room. NVDRS, what is really profound for those of you who aren't aware, is that without states being able to use NVDRS, without the funding for the coroners and for those who have access to that information, being able to report information about violent death. So when someone dies from a gunshot, knowing how old that person was, how old the perpetrator was, the manner in which they died, the type of gun that was used, the place and the circumstances of the death, NVDRS, if it's used properly, compiles the data on every single one of those incidents in a way that helps us to understand what is going on out there. Even now when we speak sometimes to the public health and medical community, they tell us that a lot of information is misreported. So you might have a 5-year-old shoot a 3-year-old and it's being reported as a homicide and not as an accident, right? Because the way that NVDRS is being applied in so many states where there isn't funding and there isn't uniform application, we don't even have the kind of baseline information about gun death and gun injury that would help us to have this conversation intelligently and to be able to look at this problem in the context of better information. So I just wanted to mention that as we've looked into NVDRS, the ways it's being used and the way in which it could help inform this subject, just to sort of get us on the same page with the fact that there's very few states that even have funding to do it at all, never mind properly. And it's something that is tremendously lacking and to me sort of shocking considering we have 100,000 people being shot every year and that we don't even have a system to understand what's going on out there, never mind assess scientific approaches and solutions.
So questions from you all?
We've identified some areas of gun regulation and gun reform that we should focus on. I was wondering if we could separate out what are some areas of gun violence regulation that we shouldn't focus on, that aren't going to be, is not likely to be as effective, and thus so we can focus our energies on the things that really are likely to be effective in this policy, in this game.
I mean,
Okay, totally defer, which is just, I think it depends on whether you're talking about efficacy or politics. You know, I think Brina or somebody brought up earlier the fact that, you know, we are all very conscious of the way in which these policies play out in the political arena, and I think we've all become aware there's certain issues that get better traction politically and others that seem to be hitting some roadblocks. Things like registration, which we're proponents of and have in states like California and are very, very effective at helping prevent guns from getting into the wrong hands. It creates some political issues and public complexity in the conversation, and so we tend to not be pushing that strongly in other states where we think it might sort of create some backlash. But certainly, and I'll leave it to others to say more about it, there's a couple of issues that, in part because of messaging from the other side, and some of the fears that are built into some of this gun regulation, we're highly conscious of the trouble there. So I'll just start with that and let others sort of weigh in.
One comment that I'd like to make is not necessarily what the gun violence prevention world is focusing on and getting wrong, but one area that others who want to discuss gun violence are focusing on, and you know, especially sometimes elected officials and public servants who want to, you know, be in this space comfortably. You know, when they're asked about gun violence and gun violence prevention and regulations, they said, well, we really need to talk about mental health. Let's talk about mental health. Oh, your question's a good one, but let's talk about mental health. And consistently, you know, try to divert the conversation when in reality, you know, we know that persons who suffer from mental illness are only responsible for about 4 to 5% of of all violence in this country. You know, we as advocates have worked very, very hard to separate the notion that persons with mental illness are the source of the gun violence problem in this country. They are not. And frankly, the NRA and Wayne LaPierre threw them under the bus when they suggested that we should have a registry of every person, you know, who's ever received mental health treatment, and yet we're not going to register anyone who buys a gun, so or the gun itself. So, you know, he's talking out both sides of his mouth in that regard. We know as advocates in this world that gun violence is caused by a number of problems, the greatest one of which is easy access to firearms by dangerous people. We can identify those dangerous people, and we have, you know, methods and policies that will stop them. You know, in comparison to other countries, other developed countries who have similar cultures to America, England, Australia, Japan, where they have violent movies, violent video games, incidents of mental illness, particularly virtually identical to ours. They don't have the number of gun deaths, you know, proportionally that we do. You know, it's just stupid, frankly, that we have this level of gun violence when other countries don't. And what is the difference? And from my perspective, they have regulations that work to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous people. They recognize them, they identify them, they do good work. So I would like to dispel the notion when you hear it, or when anybody in my world hears it, that, oh, we don't have a gun violence problem, we have a mental illness problem. Well, clearly we could provide more services and resources to persons and treatment providers for mental health, but it is a gun violence problem that is separate from the mental illness problems. They go hand in hand. We'd like to help everybody, but that would be an area that I would like people to recognize and understand it and differentiate.
In the litigation arena, I mean, there was a movement, mostly back in the 80s, of plaintiffs' lawyers who brought lawsuits under the theory that gun manufacturers, or at least manufacturers of particular types of guns, like Saturday Night Specials or assault weapons, should be liable for any shooting involving one of their guns simply because they sold a product which posed a great risk of harm, and therefore they should always bear the cost of that harm. Those are absolute liability cases. That's an example of a type of, at least lawsuit, that we have abandoned. Brady actually was never a big believer in that theory, but that's one that doesn't work for a number of reasons. One, it's probably now prohibited under federal law, but it's also not really the problem that we're focusing on, and that in our litigation we're focused on gun companies that do something wrong. I mean, the theory of liability is not that they happen to sell a gun which ended up being used to shoot someone. It's that they chose to engage in some negligent practice, such as not training their salespeople to screen for straw purchasers, or choosing to sell guns without feasible safety devices, or selling 87 guns in a single purchase when, if they use reasonable care, they'd know that person's probably not buying guns for the 87 members of their family to protect themselves. And those sorts of things, acts of negligence, and so our cases are much more focused and very supported by longstanding tort law.
I would just add that anything that has the word ban in it seems to create some issues. It's not to say that I personally think we have any need for, ammunition magazines holding more than 10 or 15 rounds at one time, and most gun owners appreciate that. But my sense from, taking the temperature of the courts and the public is that when you look at this recent DC decision, I think unfortunately a complete ban, and it was a similar situation in Illinois, complete ban on all public carry versus really tight restriction seems to trigger some problems. So, with assault weapons, with large capacity ammunition, with public carry, I think approaching things in terms of restriction and regulation seems to work much better than bans, and obviously the Supreme Court decisions rested on that as well. So, just our take is that should probably be avoided in the legislative realm if possible, if there's other ways to approach things.
Following up, I'm wondering where you see the avenues of innovation, and especially technological innovation, as new directions for reform and safety. It's striking sometimes the degree to which some of the dialogue seems to be so similar to what it was the last time we were having a public debate over gun safety in the early 1990s. There have been, in a way, the internet issue is one of them, but it does seem as if some of the promising areas deal with technological fixes, which we've seen in so many other realms. You hear frequently the analogy to cars, which are much safer than they used to be, largely because of technology or seatbelts or airbags and things like that. What are those technological approaches, and what are the obstacles to them? And are there legal and constitutional obstacles?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the gun industry is literally over a century behind the times as far as feasible safety technology. Literally, there are safety devices which are over 100 years old, cost less than $1, that would save the lives of children and others, and they are not the industry standard. Now, the reason that it's not is because of the CPSC exemption, which always was a bad thing. It should have been repealed. But now, after Heller, there's a much easier case to be made that it should be repealed, because the gun lobby argument, which I didn't think was correct before Heller, but it was essentially, if the CPSC has authority to regulate guns, it can declare that they're unreasonably dangerous and it's a backdoor way to ban guns in America or ban handguns or something. Well, that can't happen after Heller. It never was going to happen, but it definitely can't happen now. So I think because of that, there really should be a renewed attempt to repeal that exemption. But even with it, states can require safety devices in guns. California has done some. In New Jersey, a number of years ago, there was a law passed which essentially required that once so-called smart gun technology or user-authorized technology becomes feasible and on the market in some respects, then that technology will become mandated in New Jersey after a couple years or so. And actually, we at the Brady Center brought a lawsuit against the New Jersey Attorney General to force New Jersey to comply with the law, which it hasn't done. It's supposed to report every 6 months about whether technology is feasible or on the market. It hasn't done anything. It issued one report, which they say they can't find in over, I think, 10 years. It is over 10 years. So there's state regulation. There's also litigation, which can incentivize these sorts of safety devices. But what are some of the things the industry can do and should do? There is the so-called smart technology, the user-authorized devices where the gun recognizes the authorized gun owner, through biometrics, through thumbprint. I don't have the latest model iPhone, but I'm told that it has a thumbprint recognition system. My bet is people use that many more times than you would your gun, which often sits in your gun case, hopefully, or perhaps in your night table drawer for years without being used. So it gets less wear and tear is my point. But that's one type of technology, and that's sort of the gold standard. And there's no question that would save a tremendous amount of lives, particularly the incidents you read about of kids finding the parent's gun, using it to shoot a sibling or a friend. All of a sudden, that gun can't be fired. And that technology is out there now. It's a reality. It could have been a reality decades ago, but there's no question it's reality now. And as people know, in the DC area, there's a company, Armatix, in Germany, that's created this gun. There was a gun dealer in Rockville, Maryland, that announced that he was going to put it up for sale. He then got death threats, and people threatened to burn down his store. And so he, in a rather interesting video, which you can see with him with his guns behind him and a bottle of bourbon, told his friends in the gun community that he had changed his mind and he was not going to sell the gun because of the death threats. But the technology is out there. There's also less advanced technology that's sort of similar, that has been feasible for decades, like an internal lock that can be key operated or key operated with a combination. And we had a lawsuit actually against Beretta over 10 years ago, where we went into actually the discovery of what Beretta had done with their with safety devices, and it showed that for decades, inventors had been sending patents to Beretta, begging them, put in these safety devices here. I've got the patent. You can have it. I want to save lives. And they would put it in a drawer, and they didn't even discuss it. And in that case, our expert, just a guy, he was a very smart guy, an engineer, but had no support, was able to make a handgun with a built-in internal lock, which Beretta, one of the top gun manufacturers in the world, had never taken the time to do. So there's that. There's a number of other safety devices, magazine disconnect safeties, and others that no question they would save lives, and hopefully now there'll be more of a move to get them implemented.
I just was going to make one quick comment on the smart technology that's available out there. One potential use for that we've been discussing internally and looking at and debating on with law enforcement, the potential that it has to help law enforcement. One of the areas law enforcement trained for hundreds of hours, literally hundreds of hours on the use of weapons, from muscle memory to judgment to retention. Retention is one big component that law enforcement uses, that is taught to law enforcement to safely carry a firearm in public, is retention. And, one of the suggestions is that this smart technology could really help our law enforcement and give them the potential for comfort level that when they're carrying a firearm, that it cannot be taken away from them and then used on them. And you see that in some instances when someone's been successful in attacking a policeman. So there's a lot of uses for the smart technology, and law enforcement is one of those, I think, potential spaces that could help move the technology. If we can get our law enforcement to begin to ask for and frankly demand some of the technology that's available. So that's an area we're looking further down the road at.
This technology is pro-gun owner. It's a pro-consumer, advancement. The consumers are the gun owners. It's the gun owners' children who are often killed because of the lack of these safety devices. So, it's just particularly appalling that you have, the NRA and other groups fighting against the interests of the people that they say they are representing.
Other questions? Yes.
I was wondering, and even if it needs to be responded to, right, the ultimate kind of trope that's offered by most on the right, whether right-wing media or alike, sort of that gun regulation broadly is just part of a slippery slope to confiscating guns, right? Like that's, and when pointing to, for example, the statistics from Australia, right, it was sort of almost a wholesale ban on guns, which has sort of resulted in the decline in sort of gun deaths and the like.
It wasn't actually a ban on guns, it was just assault weapons. So, I think that's a pretty important distinction. And what was interesting in Australia is they didn't just ban them, they actually bought them all back. So they got them out of circulation. And since the Port Arthur massacre, now almost 20 years ago, there hasn't been a single mass shooting in Australia since they did that. So it's a great case study. I think all of us really like to, when we can, talk about that, because this idea that there's so many guns out there and there's no way to kind of make a dent is just something that is sort of ludicrous.
Yeah, I think you certainly hit on the raw nerve that exists out there with the most extremist portion of the gun rights crowd and the gun lobby, and how they mobilize their base so well. It's in some ways difficult to respond to, but the fact of the matter is, I respect the Second Amendment. I respect the rights of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms. But with 86 Americans dying from guns every day, there's got to be more that we can do. And no one has had a serious conversation in my lifetime, let alone in my kind of political career, talking about banning guns, confiscating guns. It's just not in our lexicon. And what the policies that we are advocating for, when we talk about individual policies, we do poll after poll where 90%, 80%. We released another poll yesterday with 2014 women voters. 93% of them support background checks, including 89% of Republican women. 81% of them support expanding the prohibitors to include stalkers and dating partners. I mean, just when we are having a rational conversation with the vast majority of Americans about the individual laws and policies that we're talking about, there's kind of no question among reasonable, rational Americans that with rights comes responsibilities, and you can talk about supporting the Second Amendment while also talking about common sense public safety measures. And most of those people that I'm talking about don't believe the hype and fear, that Lori alluded to, that, President Obama has a wild agenda to take all of your guns away. I mean, it's just not at all in the reality or the policy agenda that we're operating within. It's just like
Heller took that off the table. I mean, that's the thing, I mean, even if,
Heller
I
was a
mean,
gift
right, I
in
mean,
some ways,
I
right?
mean, Heller, as I say, we were never an organization that was in favor of banning all guns in America, even though there are people I like and respect, including, I'm sure, members of ours who probably do feel that way, but that's not the way Brady has felt. However, even if Wayne LaPierre is correct that we're all lying and we have this hidden agenda, we can't do it anymore after Heller. I mean, Heller took, the two extremes of the policy agenda or the NRA argument off the table. One was, even if you think background checks or some other reform is a good idea, you can't have it because we have Second Amendment, it's unconstitutional. That was taken off the table because Scalia, in the majority opinion, said, total bans are unconstitutional. However, there's all sorts of other laws that remain constitutional. So that you can't make that argument anymore. And the other argument was the slippery slope argument. And that's taken off the table because, unless, the president, suspends the enforcement of the Supreme Court or something, then you can't ban all guns. So it is, that was the bright side of Heller. In fact, we issued a white paper shortly after the decision saying, while we disagree with it as a matter of constitutional law and history, politically, it's probably advantageous for that very reason.
And I think it's incumbent on us to understand the messages and the ideas, and I try really hard. I spend a lot of time trying to understand and appreciate the perspective of the other side. I mean, as a good lawyer, you can't do your job without trying to grasp and understand what it is that's motivating the emotions and the perspectives of the other side. And I think that this more guns makes you safer. If we let any regulations pass, they're just going to take all of our guns away. These types of arguments that people really believe in, that really, at least for a very small, radical, energetic fringe, is very real. We need to understand that. That is what they believe. It's not going to happen. It's not possible. And in any case, that's why we have the system of government we do. Because in every arena, when it comes to the Bill of Rights and everything else that we hold most dear in this country, we trust our legislators and our courts, if the legislators don't do what they're supposed to do, to balance that and to keep it in check. And we don't look at any of our other rights and say, look at the Patriot Act, not that I want to diverge here, but there's plenty of instances where, these rights are being managed with some concern at the fringes. And we trust in our system that these things eventually balance themselves out. And so too with guns. But that argument, that confiscation argument, I mean, I live in California. One of the things we're really proud of is the really robust regulatory system we've been able to get in place in California as a model for what might be possible. And if there's anywhere where, people would sort of legitimately have a fear that it's sliding down the regulatory slope, it would be a place like California. And yet we have just hundreds of thousands, millions of gun owners in California who are owning lots of different kinds of guns and are doing just fine. The system we have in place in most states is I don't want to say pathetic, but it's pathetic. So I will say that. There's literally no regulation. A state like Arizona, literally, you can carry a gun openly in public with no permit and no background check. And you're talking about an assault weapon. I mean, that's the level of regulation you have in some states. Nothing at all. So to look at slippery slope, sure, that could be a really strong emotional argument. But how far that is from what's really happening in the majority of states in America is almost laughable to me when I look at sort of what the true regulatory nature is at this point.
So I want to thank all of you for being here, for being a part of this conversation. A big hand to our panelists for this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.